And you all have braved the snow, the ice, and no salt on our sidewalks this afternoon, so we're pretty impressed with you. My name is Judy Brownfield, and I own Books at Sunset. And yes, independent bookstores. And earlier this winter, I saw that a legend in our own time, Mike Bailey, well-known Courier News managing editor and very wonderful writer, had a book coming out from our own publishing house centered right here in Elgin, State Street Publishing, with the legendary George Rawlinson, who we will talk more of in a second. Oh heck, why not talk about him now? George Rawlinson, for the last 10 years, has been a publishing hothouse in the center of our city. He's published independent titles, he's worked with biographies, he's even gone off the edge a little bit with some very provocative titles from which you'll have to search his website for later. Right, George?
Certainly. The Franklin book, I assume?
Oh, yeah. So, via the publishing house in our own town, working together with Mike Bailey, this wonderful book of our city's past has come to be. Now, although the title says Goodbye Elgin High, it is a narrative of two stories. Two threads of information come through on this title. I started reading it at 5 o'clock this morning and I was late for church because I finished it. And I found myself, although not growing up in Elgin myself, I found parallels to my own history. I found parallels to my childhood and the old schoolhouses and the teachers with the ferocious grins and smiles. I found parallels to being downtown in a city that was thriving and lively because I arrived here in 1969 as a young girl. From a small farm town, arriving in Elgin, I found the Christmas lights, the vitality of the store windows, the ladies with their white gloves striding confidently and with purpose down the sidewalks, and the throngs of cars juggling for a space on not only Chicago Street, but Grove and Spring Street as well. As I got off the train from Chicago, I found myself in a magical place, and that was the heart of downtown Elgin in the 60s. This book portrays that energy, that vitality, that point of view from one man that kind of translates to all of us a little bit as well. On the flip side of Mike Bailey's narrative is another tale, and I am going to let our State Street publisher explain that too. The book is amazing, the book is wonderful, and with the collaboration of George Rawlinson, Mike Bailey's work is lifted off the ground in our city. So without further ado, give George Rawlinson a big hand.
Well, before we start, I want to thank these three gentlemen for coming out. I mean, it is such an honor to have three Elgin mayors. There are four living mayors. To have Mike Alft and Ed Schock and current Mayor Dave Captain here is not just an honor, but it's a privilege for all of us to hear the history, the combined history that they have, history of this city.
Woo!
All right.
Yes!
You know, when we talk about Elgin authors, the first name, the name that's always at the top of the list is Mike Alft. And Mike Alft has wrote extensively about Elgin history in general, and Jerry Turnquist, of course, is here. Mike has written extensively about Elgin history in general and its people and places in particular. I've been involved with the written word in one form or another for my entire adult life. About 15 years ago, right at the turn of this still new century, there started this reputation that Elgin was becoming, and this is not an overstatement, a sort of Yellowstone National Park of area authors. And I could click off the top of my head 25 Elgin area and Elgin authors who have had their books published in the last 15 years. Some of them are here today. John Prigge, Tom Hartwell. You can go right down the list. Mike Alft, Mike Powers, Mike Marshall, John Laban, John Fleming, John Bradley, Rebecca Hunter, Bill Briska, Sandra Miller, Tom Shales. I could go on and on and on and on. The latest in this literary lineage, and one of the best, is award-winning journalist Mike Bailey. I've known Mike for many, many years. There's never, ever been a question about his writing ability. He's a first-rate writer, and as I said earlier, with other first-rate writers, the trick is doing something that's really, really hard, but making it look really, really easy. And when you read this book, it's a really entertaining read. It wasn't as entertaining in the writing, the editing, and the proofreading. I can tell you, Mike and I certainly had some issues and some pretty anxious moments, especially as you get closer to deadline. We had an event scheduled in early November, and we were a week away, and we still didn't have a book. But we were pretty confident that we would get there. Anyway, Mike's book, Goodbye Elgin High, is a really unique addition to the Elgin literary landscape. It's really well written, it's entertaining, it's informative on a number of levels. It tells a parallel story, a coming of age. It is not a biography, it is not Mike Bailey's story. If you're looking for a Mike Bailey biography, you probably just buy him lunch and he'll give you the 10-minute infomercial. But it is really a coming of age. There's a universal involved in that book. There's a universal that really captured me. I grew up on the west side of Chicago. When I was 13 years old, I moved into a soulless community, a bedroom community of Hoffman Estates. And I told Mike, after reading his book and being around Elgin for as long as I've been around, it really makes me, I wish that I would have been part of the Elgin that people like Mike Bailey and John Prigge and people who grew up here were part of. I wasn't, but I am now. So I'm going to ask Mike to come up and talk about this book, this parallel story of coming of age, and about what happened to the city in the 1960s and early 70s, a city that is still a great city. It was a great city then, and we're hoping for continued good days.
Well, thank you. Everywhere that we've been, we've had a really nice turnout, and this is another one. And everybody has stopped to share stories about what they remember about Elgin growing up. We got cards from people. George just gave me one. Somebody remembering the lineup of the Elgin High School basketball team in 1963, and they went to their first game. That's part of what's in my book. People that worked at the foundry or knew somebody that worked at the foundry, people that are long forgotten. People really are still interested in Elgin, and that's really gratifying to see. It's our hometown, and even if you didn't grow up here, I think you'll find your hometown in there, and that's what we've been told by several different people who stopped to say, you know what, I didn't grow up here, but this is just like where I grew up. One of the questions, and I mentioned this at the library, one of the questions that I get is, well, why did you pick this era? We thought you would pick something different. The reason that I picked this era, and the reason that George assembled this group here today, is because that period from the mid-'60s to the late '60s was really an inflection point in Elgin's history. The watch factory closed, the city acquired 25 acres downtown, raised over 50 buildings, and built the Civic Center. There were changes going on socially, nationally, and locally. We were on the cusp of whatever came next, and that was a very significant point in Elgin's history. And that's what we're here to talk about today. We have several decades of public service and over 2 centuries of life sitting here.
Thank you very much.
And it's not just one guy here. But what I wanted to do, we're going to just talk to everybody here briefly. I'm going to ask kind of a general question, let them talk, and then we'd like to open this up for questions. This will go however it goes, as long as you're willing to stay and ask some questions. We're trying not to reminisce about what Mike Elf's favorite Burns malt flavor was or something. We're looking for something a little more substantive than that. What I wanted to talk about a little bit is that the decisions. Mike was mayor in 67 and was on the council from 63 to 67 when he was elected mayor. And this is that period that I chose. And Mike was not only on the council, but was mayor and was a part of some of these dramatic decisions. And the decisions that were made in the mid-'60s are the decisions that affected what Ed had to do as mayor and what Dave is doing right now as mayor. All decisions made today affect tomorrow. So I wonder if we could start with Mike and ask Mike to give us a little background on the decisions in the '60s some of the things that happened that led to the Civic Center. You and I have talked at some length about the impact of the closing of the watch factory and things, but if you could set the scene for us in the 60s on the council and in the city, and then we'll go to Ed and then Dave.
Oh, the 60s were revolutionary times. For the first time, Elgin was no longer a one high school community. In 1962, Larkin opened. And at the time it opened, I went to the city directory and found the addresses of the Board of Education members, most of whom were on the west side, and the school janitors, most of whom were on the east side. And I had about 6 or 7 socioeconomic differentiations, which meant that in the long run, the west side of Elgin would be substantially different from the east side. And of course, we had a lot of national events that disturbed things. We probably wouldn't have any disturbances in Elgin if there hadn't been problems in Detroit and elsewhere.
Mike, you were on the council during the decision-making process of the acquisition of that property and things downtown. Can you describe, a lot of people were alive then, but not all of them were from here. What was that area where the Civic Center is now? Describe that area and the decision that was made to demolish that.
Well, it was a warren of small shops, and only one substantial business. And what got it started was Hattie Hemmons giving $1 million to the city of Elgin for a community center. And the trustee of the account was in the First National Bank of Elgin, and they offered the citizens to give their opinions as to how we should use the $1 million. Some of them, quite a few in fact, wanted a big basketball stadium. Finally, they decided on a community center which became Hemmons. Then when we had the Hemmons, we had a very good and active city manager all during the 60s named Robert Brunton. And he seized on the fact that if we had a cultural center like Hemmons, we'd have a post office and a second appellate court building. And then he convinced the library to move from its old building on Spring Street to a new one in the Civic Center. And it all looked pretty good. But if you run to the government for money, and the federal government paid maybe 2/3 to 3/4 of land clearance costs, which was a major expenditure, then the government will set certain standards for you. And the problem with that civic center was that it displaced people at a time when we had no adequate housing for the people who were displaced. To make matters worse, the state hospital, where many employees live, said you can no longer live on the grounds. And so they were looking for housing. And the federal government each year looks over what you have done to fulfill your promise relating to that civic center. Did you relocate the people? We couldn't because there wasn't an adequate place to put them, which meant that in the next directive, the federal government said it behooves you then to have public housing. So our public housing units were a direct result of the civic center. If we hadn't had public housing, we wouldn't have that annual amount coming in from the federal government.
Okay, yeah, that's the story that you've told in your book and that I mentioned in mine. Ed, if you'd comment on not only what you remember about growing up in the 60s, but also maybe some impact that these decisions may have had on your tenure.
Well, first and foremost is, and I don't say this simply because he's here, he knows it. Mike Alft was a teacher of mine at Elgin High School. I was in his government class. And at the time, I think Elgin High probably had the best social studies department of any high school anywhere. Because it was very diverse. You had Homer Shelby, who was dyed-in-the-wool conservative. You had Mike, who was much more moderate to liberal. You had Howard Schulte. You had Bill Shaw in the psychology, teaching psychology. Well, I was in Mike's American government class, and following that, I made a big decision. I really did, and he knows this. I didn't know anything about going to college. Nobody in my family had ever been to college. So I decided, he said, you should go to college. And he said, and you should major in government or political science. Well, I went to college and I majored in political science. So Mike Alft was a real mentor for me personally, and his influence has had a tremendous impact on me for my entire life. In addition, Bill and Rita Shaw are here. Teachers probably had the most influence on me of any people growing up. I wasn't the easiest person to work with. I was kind of a smart ass. And, some of you would probably say still am. But Bill and Rita Shaw. Rita taught math, 8th grade, Larson Junior High School then, and Bill taught psychology at Elgin High School. I was in both of their classes. And, you know, they went a long way towards straightening me out. I remember my high school days as... high school, it was fun, you know. They were some of the greatest, you know, you kind of go through high school, at least you did then, oblivious to what's going on in the world. But as it progressed through high school and you get in classes that you have serious discussions, you realize that there were big changes coming that were affecting the whole country and were going to impact on Elgin as well. So the 60s were tumultuous. It was tumultuous, but I will also say this, when I went away to college, I can't imagine any time in modern American history that was more intellectually stimulating than being at college in the 1960s. There was a debate between professors, students, and whoever else every night of the week. You could go to one. It was phenomenal.
I agree. David?
I'm gonna relay a story that Mayor Schock and I shared, and it kind of sets the tone for what I want to say. Ed and I talked at one time. We had some people come up. We're talking about mosquito spraying and abatement in Elgin, and people, you know, it's kind of a thing. Well, some people had mosquitoes were very much in favor of abatement. Others didn't want it. Ed and I talked about at the time when we were young that we chased the truck down the street on bicycles or on foot to get in the spray. I don't know if that impacted us. Probably.
It explains a lot.
You know, I think you look back into the 1960s and what I think of as I really echo what Ed says is that Rachel Carson changed all that. The world changed in the 1960s for a lot of reasons. We went into the space age. I remember at junior high school going to watch satellite launches and things like that. We don't do that anymore. And it was just a time when the world changed around us. We're talking today about just some things I thought about last night. Civil rights actions during the 1960s. Anti-war protests, something that you never saw before during the 1960s. 1967, 1968, we had those conversations. Ed and I both went to Bradley University. And I remember Bradley is in Peoria. It's a very middle-class, hard working-class town. And the first political rally I went to was in downtown Peoria, and the speaker was George Wallace. Oh. Came from Alabama, and probably as far north as he came in 1968 to talk to the people that worked at Caterpillar. And it was amazing. You know, and to go from Elgin, Illinois to Peoria to find out what other people thought was a huge change for me. I just never realized that there were other people that didn't think like me, and there were so plenty of them. I think that it was a time for the entire country to change. It was a big change for the city of Elgin. Mike alluded to the watch factory. I remember it being torn down. I remember going through the empty building, how that changed our community for decades. And I just said the other day at the State of the City address, I really think through the work of guys like Mayor Alft, Mayor Schock, that the image of Elgin is probably better today than it has been in almost 50 years. When we lost the watch factory, the town almost lost hope. And 5,000 employees. I don't even know what the unemployment rate was in that period, but it had to be huge. And what happened to the community? What did people see for the future? And I think that the 1960s, Mayor Alft talked about the Civic Center and that thing. We're revisiting those things now. We're revisiting what to do with the Hemmons. And as a community, we're going to have to make that decision. So these things are part of the legacy that we carry from years ago, and we're going to try to address those things.
I think when the watch factory closed, it had been deteriorating for some time, and so when it finally closed, it wasn't as cataclysmic, as Mike said, as it could have been, but it had been deteriorating, and we lost a lot of really highly skilled laborers. People found other jobs in other communities. And I know Mike has talked in one of the classes that I took from him, I believe it was at ECC, we talked about the Dundies and Hanover Park Streamwood Bartlett kept Elgin's retail alive for a long time, really during the early 70s. And so a lot of these reactions are somewhat delayed. If something happens today, it doesn't mean tomorrow the lights are out. It just takes some time. Do we have some questions, or should we keep going? Yes, sir. Herb.
What I remember, I wasn't born here and I came here much later, but what I remember was that after the watch factory closed, there was a concerted effort on the part of the city to try and get small businesses in, so never would they have to be dependent on a large business again. Could anyone speak to that?
I think Mike could. Just to repeat the question for those that might not have heard. When the watch factory closed, did the city make an effort to acquire and secure some smaller businesses so that we weren't so dependent on one industry? Mike?
When the watch factory closed, the city looked at smaller businesses so we wouldn't be a one-industry town again with our fate dependent upon whether people bought watches. And I remember a council meeting when Mayor Shales was leading the city that Chrysler was looking for a place to put its Dodge plant, and there were possible 3,000 to 5,000 jobs. And I'll tell you that the city rejected it because we just ended up with another watch factory. There were other factors in rejecting it. They didn't decide. But after the rejection here in Elgin, they went to Belvedere, and that's the plan. But we couldn't have had a sufficient site to accommodate Chrysler anyway.
Okay. Other questions? Mike, when the watch factory closed, we talked a little bit about the economy. In fact, I know Clyde ran in 1963 on empty businesses, and even though the mayor really couldn't do much economically, that was what Clyde ran on. At what point did the watch factory begin to deteriorate? At what point did it begin to really have an impact?
It began sliding beginning in 1958. And about 1960, some French inventor came up with crystal vibrations, and that was the end.
And what about downtown economically? When did businesses begin to evaporate?
Yes, 1971, Woodfield opened up, and later the mall in Carpentersville, and that was the end of downtown. In fact, 3 new businesses have opened up in downtown that are symbolic of what we face down there. In 1999, and the last 2 years, they are tattoo parlors. 3 tattoo parlors. That's the beginning of the end. I'd like to comment on that social studies department. Jim Wallace and Doug Wallace. After we got together and talked all about this, and you realize high school students are not concentrating on their studies. They have part-time jobs. They are experimenting with relations with the opposite gender. I have to use gender because in my class we could never use that 3-letter word. It was too exciting. And they had other interests, sports and so on. And so we knew as teachers we had to make our classes interesting and exciting because we were competing with a TV tube, that's what we were competing against. And we had teachers who knew how to do this. Now, in order to do it successfully, and I think we were, you have to be a little crazy yourself.
Define crazy.
Yeah, right.
Ed, do you remember?
Ed and Dave, I'm just curious, you know, you and I and all kind of grew up together. What were some of the things that you guys did in the 60s? I remember in some of the things in the book, places we went, odd things that we did. What were some of the things you did, Ed, on the weekends? And we want a lot of details. And we want names.
I'm not at liberty to disclose all. I am married. But no, well, a lot of the things we did, you mentioned, I mean, it was very parallel. I mean, all of us kind of did the same things. I mean, a lot of our world revolved around going to Elgin High School basketball and football, but more basketball. I mean, Elgin was a real basketball town. I mean, and it was, until Larkin came about, it kind of unified East and West Side kids, I think, going to sports events and basketball and things like that. You know, we hung out at places, some of them downtown, like the Star Sandwich Shop, 25-cent or 22-cent burger. It was a great place. We shopped at Spees and Ackerman's for most of our clothes, and Chuck Hines when we really wanted to splurge. We went to a lot of school and community dances that were sponsored. One of them was every Friday night at the YMCA on Channing, right?
Right, 10 to 12.
10 to 12. And we all went to that. That was great. You know, the guys always went with the false hope of leaving with a female. Let me tell you, that happens so infrequently. We almost always left with the same ragtag group of guys that we came with. Believe me, these gals wanted nothing to do with us, especially if you didn't have a car. If you didn't have a car, nobody was going to walk with you from the 10 to 12. So a lot of our activities, and then of course later in the 60s, a lot of us went off to school. And when you go away, you kind of lose track of Elgin. One of my memories is when I came back to Elgin in 1970, because I usually spent my summers down in Peoria as well. It was kind of like coming back to, you know, it was different. You know, there was a lot about Elgin I didn't recognize anymore, and it had only been gone 5 years, so, because I stayed down there an extra year. And that was a big shock, and it took some readjustment, but by and large, the time in Elgin and being a high school student in Elgin and so on was a very pleasurable experience. We had a lot of fun, a lot of good, clean fun.
Dave, you're up.
I remember riding around downtown, and we used to cruise the circuit around the Tower building. The Tower Grill was down there. There were a number of places that were down there, and probably put on 5,000 miles. Never went more than about 6 blocks. And got the gas mileage in those cars was about 8 or 10 miles per gallon. So my wife and I are environmentalists, and she's probably cringing someplace not heard me talk about this, but I don't know how many gallons of gas we burned up and went nowhere. And it was the same thing. We always thought, well, we're going to find girls down there. We never found them. Went away to college, thought it was going to be better, and went to Bradley. And I remember at Bradley, a number of us got in the car and went over to Illinois State because we thought the girls were over there. After about 10 trips, we kind of figured out, we're going that way, I think they're going this way. It didn't work out for any of us, but that was really a big part of a young person's life. And I think that it was just the downtown, and it kept people active down there. We all knew each other. We'd get done riding around, maybe we'd go out to A&W, get a root beer, something like that, or we'd go get a little something to eat. And that was a small town atmosphere in a community that was starting to get to be a city.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing we probably all remember is you could get anything that you wanted in Elgin. You didn't have to go anywhere else. There were hundreds of small shops, medium-sized shops. There were no real shopping malls that were necessary. That at that time you could almost do everything in town.
Movie houses.
Yeah, there was a lot of movie houses. And I think that speaks to what everybody has been talking about is when you go away, and you see that life is different, that there's different people, there's different discussions, there's different philosophies, there's different everything. And you spent your whole life here, and you get away, and it's not the same. And I think maybe in a way that's better now than it was then, because we're exposed to more things, but it doesn't have that same familiarity, I guess. Yes, Libby?
Where were the girls?
They were with the guys that
Yeah, that's right, And what Ed said is exactly right. We'd all go hopeful and we'd all go wrong.
Were the girls going home at the same rate?
Well, what always happened is we'd end up at Lazar's and they'd be at Lazar's at a different table. Jeff?
My wife and I moved down in the late 80s, and I had never been in Elgin until she moved out here early. But I found out years later that she had been here before. And when she was in college down in River Forest, one of her roommates was from Crystal Lake. And the shops weren't the only magnet for young ladies who weren't from Elgin, because they had to come out here, go to Crystal Lake to get the young lady's card, and they were part of this cruising. I was told about that. So there were girls there, but yes.
They were in different cars, that's right.
You're not helping me out up
Yeah.
there.
Sure.
There used to be sock hops after the basketball games.
Right.
That's one of the things the girls that I hung out with did in that year. Those were early. You guys are all late.
There was the great big sock out, the girls would stand in one big cluster and the boys would circle like the lions and the wildebeest.
seldom they met.
Yeah, seldom they met, that's right. Other thoughts or questions? Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, well, I moved to Elgin in 1970, and there were banners all around that said Elgin Shopping Center in Condon, Illinois. And then my impression is that it was already after the fact. And also, Herb used to call it the paseo, because in Mexico, the girls walk one way and the boys walk the other way
Yeah.
around the.
Maybe that's what was wrong.
Maybe
Herb?
That shows that I wasn't the sharpest knife in the fight.
The other place I used to go around was Lord's Park, and not only, downtown, they would make a circle there, and that's why the city fathers at that time blocked it off so you couldn't make a complete circle.
Right, yeah, that's, Ed just mentioned that might have been a place where certain people, not us, certainly, drank beer. That is true. Before going, yeah, or to drown the sorrows afterwards. But yes, they used to, that was the other circuit, was through Lord's Park over and over and over again for no apparent reason.
Mike, I have a question.
Yes, George.
Two questions. Ask each one of the mayors what they miss most about the 1960s in Elgin, and also, did they have a favorite place in the 1960s in Elgin?
Okay, Dave, you want to start?
Sure. I think that what I miss most, when I was little, I remember getting on a bicycle, and I lived far on the southeast side, and we biked all the way over to Wing Park, and we could go swimming at Wing Park, and I remember getting a frozen Snickers bar at the refreshment stand when I left, spend all day there, and it didn't cost anything. It was safe to do that. We didn't have the issues that we have now where your child is out all by themselves going all the way across town. We weren't scared about those kind of things. And it was just a place where a kid could grow up and do the things that a kid did. We played baseball. My mother would send us out. I'd go out at 9 in the morning, and we'd go out and play baseball for 7 or 8 hours. And that's how a child grew up at that time. We don't do that anymore. And I think that's something that I think everybody misses. And it's the socialization was a big part of it. We grew up with kids that I remember. I look back at a photo from Garfield School when I was in 2nd grade. And I can look down the rows and just about remember every name and every person that's there. I can't remember people that I met 3 weeks ago. So I think that's something that, and it's when we grew up together, and I think that was the small town atmosphere. I really miss that part of a bigger city.
Right. Ed, do you want to go next?
Well, for me, I have to separate the early 60s from the middle and late 60s because I was gone in the late 60s, and I think a lot happened and changed, but I think in the early 60s there was kind of a false innocence about Elgin and actually our country and the world. But then in 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated, and I can remember spending the entire weekend in my home in the family room with all of my family members. I was one of 7 children, and my mom and dad, and I don't think we got up from our seats watching the coverage on television of Kennedy's funeral and all that went along with that. It was just a riveting time and a game-changing time. And then, of course, in the late 60s, we had the tumultuous time of the Vietnam War. I was of draft age then, so it was a big thing for me. I hate to say it, but I can count over a dozen names on the Vietnam War of classmates of mine at Elgin High School and other places along the way. That was a sobering time. I mean, it was not idyllic in the late 60s. It was rough. And then, of course, the absolutely United States changing and Elgin not immune, quest for civil rights. And again, in just 2 months prior to, in 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated, and 2 months after that, Robert Kennedy was assassinated. So this was a tumultuous time in our country, and it wasn't something that Elgin, I don't think, could escape. We were part of it. We were affected by it. I remember being in the crowd in front of Spies with Harry Siegel. We were in Larson Junior High School together in Will Langle's social science class. If you brought a note from your parents, you could go down to see presidential candidate John F. Kennedy in front of Spies. 10,000 people came that day, and nobody expected more than a few thousand to be there. Harry and I were probably the only 2 Democrats in the class. So we walked down together. We had our notes. We walked down there together to see him, and we got in trouble because we were so, and this is, we were so psyched after that we just were walking along and talking, and by the time we got back, Will Langle was steaming. He was ready to give us a couple of detentions. But it was just a wonderful memory of Elgin at that time that, would then, with his assassination, would really have an amazing impact on all the people in Elgin who had been there to see him, saw him, got elected. I mean, his election in and itself was unlike most other elections. It was seen by people as, some saw it as horrific, others saw it as an enormously energizing event that was going to cause real change in our country. So just a lot of different emotions and things going on at the time that were hard to categorize.
Is there anybody, before we get to Mike, was there anybody here that was also downtown watching Kennedy? Okay, yeah, there were some people, yeah. Mike?
Well, in the first place, I spent a lot of time in the southeast end at Burns Drug Store. And the students were impressed with my stories coming out of there. So finally, 3 of them, with a tape recorder, went down with me after school and watched me down 3 Burns malls in 51 minutes. Later, I asked how many scoopfuls of ice cream are in each one. 8 scoops of ice cream. And then the other place I admired too was the library, because in the early 60s, Leroy Abbott, he taught at Abbott, and he was trying to organize a historical society, and I got to talking with people like Kendall White and Merrill Kalam and Frank Guth, that's a woman, who go all the way back before 1920, and they tell me all these stories, and I get interested in what they were saying. And so I began writing a little history of my own. My first little book was the history of Elgin High School. Most of that was written in the basement of the library, because when I was mayor, I just had to find some place where people couldn't get at me. My name was in the phone book, and I spent, I don't know how many hours each week talking to people on the phone. But the library, I asked them not to tell anybody where I was. And I was in the basement there because they had a microfilm machine was broken, and I was the only one who knew how to use it. And so I was hiding down there, and writing the history of Elgin High School. Bob Brunton, the city manager, look up what our fines were for traffic violations and how much we collected for each violation in Elgin in comparison with Aurora, and Aurora was collecting 3 to 4 times as much. And this is because, as Mike explained in his book, if you went before John Henderson with a certain lawyer, the case was dismissed. So at the next council meeting, I brought this up. And I said, this is not right. Well, you know what happened? At the next session, Judge Anderson marked dismissed on every case. Bang, 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 right down the line. Didn't even hear the case on every one that had an Elgin ticket. And everybody was quiet about this. And nobody, I couldn't speak. I spoke out enough, and that's what happened. But I didn't want to speak out again because he'd do it again. You had no idea. Some people who get elected to public office will do. We had one on the council who everybody knew was really off the base. And Bob Brunton went to a psychologist who was also a handwriting analyst, and he took a sample of the councilman's handwriting, and the psychologist looked at this and said, "Well, you have a sociopath." which we all knew.
So we're going to ask for handwriting samples. Except, yeah, you're immune, John, because you're here. But, other questions, comments? Yes, sir.
My name is Glenn Peterson, and I'm a member of this church here at this building. And my wife and I moved here in the fall of 1960. This church was 4 years old at the time. It was a composite of the membership here was a lot of the watch factory people, and it was just beginning for them to be moving away. I was hired by United Airlines, and O'Hare was just beginning to crank up. And as time went on, there were 13 of us hired by United that belonged to this church. And there was 113 pilots in the area that had Elgin addresses by 1980. I think that was an example of what happened when the watch factory shut down. The area around Elgin expanded. I was from Northwest Iowa, small high school with 10 in my high school class. My freshman college roommate was Jim Burnage.
Oh, my goodness.
Jim was a 52 graduate of Elgin High, and I think there was, 500, 600 kids in the class. So we were Mutt and Jeff there at Iowa State. But because I knew the Burnage family, I knew that all the property out here west was being developed, we ended up living here. We were one of the very first airline pilots to move here, and as you can see, by 1980, there was 113 of them up and down the Fox River. So I think that was a good example of what was happening after the watch factory shut down. Now, all these pilots weren't even businessmen, they were just pilots, but they lived here, and it was a good place. The expressway had just moved out, O'Hare had just moved in, they made a good spot for that. And the place, Fox River, is still a pilot ghetto for that example, but that was what happened.
Thank you.
We had an airport too.
Yes, Elgin had an airport at some time. Yes, ma'am.
I know that because of what happened in the 1960s, my family was promoted to come here from Chicago and bring their business. And whoever was involved in that, I don't know if Mr. Elf was in that, I just want to say thank you.
Other thoughts, comments?
Over here.
Oh, yes, ma'am. Oh, that's my wife. I'm able to go home tonight. Go ahead. Yes, ma'am.
I've got a question for basically all of you, I guess, but how much do you think the Elgin experience in the 1960s did to change for the better or worse the east-west divide in Elgin? The city's image of itself, where it was once a one-horse factory town, to where it is today?
How do we think the city evolved from that period? Ed, you want to start?
Well, I don't know, probably get in trouble for saying this. I think the watch factory was both a blessing and a curse. I think the fact that we were a one factory, one horse town made us kind of insular. And when the watch factory left, we weren't as prepared as we should have been or could have been to recognize what the real world was like. That you needed a diverse economy, that the economy was changing. It wasn't going to be built around gigantic employers, but it was going to be built more around a variety of middle-sized companies. And there was more stability in that and protection for the community in that. I think we had a lot of insularity. I think, and I had two grandparents that worked at the watch factory for 40 years, and it seemed like that's all they knew. I mean, when you got together with them, the only thing they talked about was watches and the watch. And I knew there was something more. And, but I think so. I think, Chris, my thing would be being a one-horse town in many ways, I think, impeded Elgin's progress and slowed its recovery after the watch factory left. And I think a lot of people couldn't get over it. I mean, the mourning period after the watch factory left was extremely long.
Just like the downtown retail.
Yeah, I mean, so,
Get over.
Mike?
And Mike, you mentioned something interesting earlier, that you looked at where the support staff lived and where the administrators lived in U46, and when Larkin opened, you realized that there would be a change between how the west side was developed and what would happen to the east side.
Well, it hurt the east side, although it was good for basketball. Larkin never did get a good basketball team all during the 60s. But in the early 60s, Elgin was really kind of a big, small town. I think you described that one time you come. A big, small town. You could go down on shopping days or on Saturday morning, and you're bound to find somebody you knew on your block or where your father worked. And it had all the disadvantages of a small town too. What it wasn't like to be a teacher and read in the Courier News on a Monday evening that there was a marital dispute leading to the call of police in this family, and then realize that the next morning, a Tuesday morning, the children in that family wouldn't be in school. That's one of the problems. And a lot of people were not living decently here in Elgin because we hadn't had inadequate housing, that they were living in basements. And remember, too, that we had these two racial disturbances. And I contacted the OEO in Washington about this because the OEO sent the two, what they call leaders in, who were actively involved in stirring the community up. And I can remember their names. I'll never forget them, Leander Scott and Sam Thomas. But I would go around after the disturbances. I must have made 25 to 30 talks to church groups and civic groups that these disturbances did not come about because of Sam Thomas and Leander Scott. They were the people here who happened to lit the fire. But if the tinder was dry, they couldn't have done it. And we had a lot of problems in the way we treated African Americans in the early 60s, particularly since we were getting middle-class blacks in. I can remember one middle-class black family, the Poindexters, they moved to the west side, they had KKK pins on their front sidewalk. Ernie Fisher couldn't find a decent place to live, and he was a microbiologist at Fordham's. So that, remember, in the as late as about 1960. Some blacks could not try on clothes. They could not go into certain places to eat. Lake Street Memorial Park would not bury them. And this is what led to all those disturbances. And so it was rough for Elgin to realize that we lived in a different world. And I like to think that we've learned lessons so that we can look at this Hispanic influx and see that eventually it should turn out right. Because most of you know that if the phlebotomist who took your blood at Provena, or the sharp teller in the bank, or the cashier in the drugstore, they are Hispanic and they can speak English fluently, then many can't. But when I'm at the library, and I'm there almost every day, I see these little kids come in to the library with their teachers in this first, second grade. And I say to the teachers, how many of these will be speaking English when they're graduating? Most all of them. And many of them already are credit to this community. And we can't control what is a national problem. And we just have to adjust to it and make things as possible for all people to live well here in Elgin.
Right. Dave.
Chris, to answer your question, I think that when I was, and this goes back to the late 50s and early 60s, when I grew up, there were two sides of town, the south end and the north end. And when Larkin High School was built, and we divided the classes up, many of the kids that I'd gone to school with had gone to the west side. And now as mayor, and we all know that the school was built as the result of growth, but didn't necessarily cause it. So the growth had already started to move there, and I think that really started to initiate the talk of the east side and the west side. And I remember the tragic day when the first time Larkin beat Elgin in basketball. And it was like a 5-year-old beating up on a man. And we just didn't understand what happened. There was no rationale to that. And, it was. I think that was the day that it changed for everybody. And I think that we look back and we all enjoyed the rivalry, and we've enjoyed it since. And I think that was the time for me to define what it kind of split the community.
Right. Libby.
We came to Elgin in 1965 when my husband joined that amazing social studies class, teachers at Elgin High School. My husband was from New York, I was from Ohio, he had gone to Northwestern. We lit in Elgin and said, this is the kind of community we want to raise a family in. The watch factory had just closed. How stupid were we? We didn't know that this was going to be a problem for Elgin. And obviously, we have had a wonderful life here in Elgin. But one other thing I wanted to say was, I don't know if people are aware of the fact, but there are a number of musicians who are employed by the Elgin Symphony Orchestra who are so struck by Elgin and its basic nature and what a wonderful community is, that they're finding it much easier to move to Elgin and live here, even though it's just the 32 sessions or weeks a year, and gig in Chicago, than it is for them to live in Chicago and come out here. And that is just one little evidence of the fact that people come into this community and get a sense that it is a community which is so different than even any old subdivision, because it has a spirit of its own.
It always has. Yes, Herb.
Yeah, I remember I had come here to do a one-year internship at the state hospital and retired after 37 years. But when we first came in, the state hospital had a mixture of whites and blacks, and we got along fairly well. And I remember going out, trying to find a place where we could go out together. And the only place that we were able to and be sure of being served was the Howard Johnsons where they used to be. So Elgin has changed a little bit. And along with that, we had one of the employees who was in personnel, and actually they did a lot of hiring. Her husband, she was the person who had in personnel, and her husband was a psychiatrist at the hospital. When they needed a larger house, they moved, and their former house was bought by white people. And that was the first time I'd ever heard of that. So Elgin really, it wasn't all, it sort of changed, and it was, you have what we have today.
Right. Yes, Ed.
Elgin was no different than all the towns of this
Right.
kind, and the collar counties are out. You should have been, if you were a black person, you wouldn't even gotten the door in DeKalb where I was working. So, you need to kind of lay off.
It's the perspective. It's
Yeah,
the perspective. This was the way it was everywhere. And it changed here, and I think Ed pointed that out, that it was changing here, it was changing everywhere. And it wasn't just Elgin that was this way. This was the way that it was in the country.
And if you're talking about, the city council treated the whole southeast area shamefully. That whole floodplain created by the Poplar Creek down there on the southeast side. They ignored that for years. It flooded out the Laurel Street trailer camp and all those white southern Illinois people that rented it, and at those substandard housing down there on that Collingborn property down there, and nobody paid any attention, and nobody gave them any help down there. In one case, they took all the farm buildings, a barn, a chicken coop, and outbuildings, and they converted them into living space, and they housed those people that came up here to work at the state hospital and out there, and the city council just looked the other way, so.
It was a different time then. That's
Yeah,
right.
it was a different time, and the blacks weren't the only ones that were mistreated. Yeah.
You're right, Ed. It was a different time, and that's what we're talking about. It wasn't all perfect, and no one's saying it was all perfect, but it certainly in many ways is better now than it was then. It's a lot more equal now than it was then.
Absolutely.
Right, and we don't, and if you've read the book, we don't want to get lost in the fog of nostalgia here, that everything back then was absolutely perfect in every way and things aren't now. That was never the purpose of the book. It's just to help you get a sense of place. Things were different then, and they weren't perfect then. And it doesn't mean that no one cared back then, it just meant that was the way that things were done. And they're not done that way anymore, and there's been a lot of change. And I can tell you that the three guys sitting here right now advanced change in this town more than anybody could ever know. The things that went on that you saw publicly, but there's a lot of things you didn't see publicly. Mike Alft was a champion for change long before that became popular. He was not a particularly popular man at certain times, but he recognized what needed to be done. And, well, it's the truth. I mean, anybody that was around then knows that. Ed and Dave have worked tirelessly for the city of Elgin, for the image of the city, for the substance of the city. I know from covering the city of Elgin during Ed's administration that he had a plan for the city. Not everybody agreed with that plan, but his idea was this has to become a complete community, and it gets there these ways. Some of it works, some of it doesn't work. Some of it's supported, some of it isn't. What Dave is doing right now is trying, and very successfully, to advance the image of the city through culture, through the arts, etc. It's been pretty successful. Elgin does have a much better reputation. These three guys here deserve an awful lot of credit for all the things that's happened in Elgin that's been good. I'm sorry, we have one more question. Yes, ma'am.
What was the population of Elgin in 1960?
60,000?
Mike, was it 45?
47 and 50, about 63.
In 1960, 63? Okay, about
49,500 was
Yeah,
when I
it
moved
was-
to Elgin in 1959, the sign on the
it was
outskirts said 49,500.
Right. Other thoughts, questions? We're at 3, so I kind of told these guys that I can't pay them overtime. So, Tom, last question?
You comment on some of the people who made names for themselves in sports in Elgin during the 1960s.
There was a lot of people. In fact, a lot of them are right there in that book. So. There's a lot of them. George, do you want to wrap us up here?
Well, we want to thank everyone for coming. Books will be available, of course. They're $19.95. That includes Mike Bailey's autograph. And,
The autograph's $19.95. The book is free.
You know, it is such a privilege, again, to have these 3 mayors here. It's a rare opportunity. I mean, I know all of them personally. Most of you probably do as well. But to get the 3 of them here collectively, especially Mike Alft, I mean, it's a real privilege. Privilege for us, really, to be here to listen to their stories and to the history that they have in Elgin. So thank you for coming.
We do thank you for coming.
Especially Mike Alft, because at the age of 88, I am a genuine certified Elgin historical relic.
At the heart of a city are its people. And for those of you who came out today to remember what it was and what it still is and will continue to be in the future, thank you so much from the bottom of our hearts for braving the ice and the snow and coming out to join us with these 3 wonderful men who we all agree are part of the heart of our town. Today, the books are for sale, and as we said earlier, even if you didn't grow up in Elgin, there is that essence of the hometown running as a strong thread through that book. I grew up in a small town, and I still felt a connection. So, as a surprise for everyone here today, if you go to the bookstore next week and say Elgin High, we'll offer you a $6 little spiff on anything that you buy that's a gently read book. So thank you so much for coming out today. Have a great time and enjoy meeting the men. Oh, one more moment from another man who's important to our city. If you don't know him already, this is Ernie Broadnax, a wonderful man who is at the heart of our history in our African American community.
I would like to say, I'm really sorry I missed this. My church had their annual Men's Day, and I was a big part of that program. And I got out, it snowed, I was just able to get over here. And I'm sorry that I missed this. And I apologize to the hostess and everybody for being late. I do want to say one thing, and usually I'm long-winded, but I won't be today. I want to say one thing publicly. I want to issue a public statement of thanks to this mayor. A lot of thanks to this mayor, not only as a mayor, but as a gentleman that has put a lot of our history together for the black community. And I want to thank this mayor who is doing a tremendous job keeping all the things that they started going. And I wanted to thank them publicly. There's some things, had I been here earlier, I would have shared with you about the racial disturbances, about all the changes that I've seen in the city of Elgin since returning here in '66. In 1966, do you remember the name of a housing project on Woodland Avenue that you wanted torn down?
Casa Linda.
Casa Linda. I asked you guys, but you know, I lived there for a little while. And I wanted to talk about that. That was interesting. But that's where I lived for a little while. And it's wonderful seeing that gone and replaced by a beautiful skateboard and playground down that way. But Elgin has changed tremendously for the black people. There's still some things that need to happen, but Elgin has changed so tremendously since I got out of the Marine Corps after 10 years and came back to Elgin. It was changing, and of course I couldn't find a place to live, so I lived in Casa Linda.
I couldn't get a place to rent or couldn't get a place to buy. After I did the 10 years in the Marine Corps, that bothered me. It still bothers me, but it doesn't bother me as much because now blacks live all over the city of Elgin, wherever they can afford to live. And that's a great, big plus. And in addition to that, many other fine things have taken place, which really has got to the point now where I feel this is an all-American city. And I want to thank these gentlemen for that.
Thank you very much.